Hi, everyone, and welcome to Left Unattended, the podcast where we pull back the curtain on what it really means to be neurodivergent in the workplace. I'm your host, Ron Sosa, and together we'll explore the stories that often go untold, like the experiences, challenges, and wins that shape how we show up at work, whether the systems around us were ready or not. Today's guest is Dr. Alex Harrison, who is a profoundly deaf veterinarian, consultant, and founder of Vetquity Consultancy, dedicated to building veterinary workplaces where everyone belongs. Awarded the 2025 Australian Veterinary Association President's Award, he is recognized for shifting the Overton window of what the profession sees as possible in equity, accessibility, and inclusion. Please welcome Alex Harrison. Hi and welcome. I'm super excited to meet you, Alex. Like you and I just talked a couple minutes ago before we started, and I like to say I've been stalking you on LinkedIn for about a year, watching what you're doing on the other side of the globe. But give us your introduction.
Thanks for having me, Ron. I'm really excited to come on board your podcast, Left Unattended. Likewise, I've also been stalking you. It's been a mutual thing. I think we tend to gravitate towards people who are doing the kind of work that we're doing, and there's definitely a need for change in the veterinary profession globally.
So how did you get to so I've been watching you. Your intro tells me you're profoundly deaf. I see you advocating on the neurodiversity side a lot, but also in inclusion and other equity inclusion areas in veterinary. So how did you get to doing that? I'm always fascinated by the journey.
It's a pretty long arc, really, but I was born profoundly deaf, and I was the first profoundly deaf veterinarian to graduate in Australia 25 years ago.
Oh, wow.
And back then there was no disability, no representation. And in fact, I actually had to make contact with a group of deaf vet doctors, paramedics, and nurses in the United States. And they were my lifeline apprentices, and we were swapping ideas on how to do things. And then I worked in academia, in corporate practice. I became a business partner for 10 years, and I burned out. And that burnout was the result of the cognitive load, I suppose, of trying to manage with being profoundly deaf, and I nearly walked away from the profession. But something in me decided to hold on and decided I wanted to give back to the profession somehow. And I, by chance, came across a group called the Veterinary Kaleidoscope, which was just beginning in Australia. And one of the vets who was heading the group was Kate Toyer, who was a trained vet. And she invited me onto the podcast with her and a guy called Cam War, who is an Indigenous or First Nations man. And it was the first podcast for the Veterinary Kaleidoscope, and we got talking and we realised that, wow, we had a lot in common, and wow, 90% of what we were dealing with had overlaps. And I think it was the moment where we kind of really went, there's no point advocating for a specific niche anymore. We need to work together. And out of that, we started having regular summits, which we have every single year. We're having our fourth one in March next year. And we did a lot of advocacy work, and then eventually that led into neurodiversity. And I'm not neurodivergent myself, but I have a lot of affinity for my neurodivergent colleagues because there's a lot of parallels between being profoundly deaf and neurodivergence in the challenges that we face and the solutions that we need.
Yeah, I see that a lot, just in intersectionality as a whole, or any marginalized group. There's that need to fit in, trying to mask or code switch or whatever the words you want to use across different marginalized communities. But I definitely see the same thing here, where there's definitely an overlap. I love that you kind of brought that these groups come together. Like that, to me, is something we need here in the US as well.
We certainly have noted that. When we look to the UK and when we look to the US, a lot of the different marginalized groups do seem to be working in silos And I almost wonder whether there'll be a lot more benefit to working together. In fact, if you think about it, as you said, the intersectionality is incredible. But I suppose also means that the people who have intersectional identities are more likely to feel lonely. If you are queer but you have a disability, you don't feel like you completely belong in the disabled community. You don't completely feel like you belong in the queer community. So we recognize that quite early on.
Yeah. As someone who, I probably claimed my queer identity early on, just finding out who I was, but I didn't get my diagnoses until later in life. I got mine at like in my mid to late 20s for ADHD, and then my ASD later in 2020. And then to find out I got it at 3 years old was just kind of a crazy, wild ride for me. But yeah, I think you're 100% spot on. So what do you do now for practices? Because I see you doing consulting out there for some of these groups. Like, what do you help them with specifically?
So I work full-time as a clinical vet, and my consultancy is called Veterinary, which has been going for about 4 or 5 months now. And I do that in my spare time. The plan is to eventually grow that to allow me to scale back on the clinical load. I want to help the profession to solve some big problems. And as far as I'm concerned, a lot of the problems we have around retention and nutrition are related to the fact that we haven't identified or grasped as a profession is that so many of us have disability, chronic illness, and neurodivergence, and we're not catering for them. So that's where a lot of the consultancy work is around now. It's small at the moment, but the diverse group that I'm working with are very broad. They range from small animal specialists to multiple site emergency centres to conservation medicine. People are definitely starting to slowly wake up to the need, but they still haven't quite joined the dots that it's a big plank in the retention and nutrition crisis that we have in veterinary medicine.
Yeah, I don't know about what you see, but in my coaching with clients, I really work heavily in trying to find the authentic self, right? And I know there's controversy out there, like, I don't want the authentic self, I want the genuine self, right? Like, to me, that's a lot of BS. Like, I work with a lot of like, let's find out who we are and what our own core needs are, because that is what stops us and burns us out in veterinary medicine. When we give all of ourselves to the profession, not only is there like a little bit of an identity loss, because that's like we make vet med our whole identity, but then just not even understanding what our core needs are or how to speak up for them. Like, I find that's really the erosiveness of the burnout. Do you find something similar over there?
Absolutely. We see a lot of, anecdotally, we have a lot of people who speak to us who are burning out or who have mental health concerns or who are wanting to leave the profession because they don't. And in fact, a lot of it comes about because a lot of employers and leaders don't recognize that it's impossible for people to separate who they are and not bring that to work. You might say be professional and leave that at home, but then we spend so much of our lives working. You're simply asking people to brush it down into boxes and hide it away. And all that does is it should cause you increase cognitive load and increase drain. And that has an impact over time. And I think part of the problem is that in Australia, I'm sure it's universal everywhere, is that some of our definitions of what is professional, it probably needs to be redefined. Professionalism is weird. What is professional? And then what is resilience? All of these codes and concepts that we have, they need to be thoroughly interrogated. And I think one of the problems we have in Australia is what I call the hidden curriculum, what they teach you in veterinary school. And it has a very long tail that goes through the profession for years afterwards. And people have to spend decades unlearning these kind of things. But it causes untold damage, I think.
Yeah, I'm seeing similar on the management side. So I'm a CPPM and manage practices and co-own practice. But I see the same thing in leadership too, where we have these leadership ideals. You've got all these books that tell you how to do things a certain way, and And then when I look at it and I read these books and I'm just like, that's like, can we take this and then also caveat like, and for a different brain, it works this way, right? Like I had a previous guest on Suzanne and we were talking about the eat the frog concept, right? Like her and our ADHD does not allow us to eat the frog. But if I got my current boss, Andy Rourke, he's like, he said something like called eating the candy. And I love that concept, right? It's like, give me the low hanging fruit, give me the momentum, and then I can eat the frog later on. But you give me the frog first thing in the day and I collapse and I got nothing left in me and the executive function is bad. So yeah, I definitely read these management books and go, they just don't work for everyone.
Well, I think it's because when you look at them fundamentally, a lot of them are really written in what I call deficit-based language, and they have a lot of duo-sum thinking in them. And one of the transformational things that we could have is we move to a strengths-based approach. For example, in my team, a lot of people assume that as a deaf veterinarian, we struggle with stethoscopes and telephones and listening to cardiac murmurs. And I use a visual stethoscope, and that allows me to see the heart sounds in a visual format. And it works very well for me. Now, occasionally I'll still get my colleagues to have a listen to a cat's shifts or dog slangs and say, look, I think I can hear a murmur, do you agree? And they'll be like, no, can't do it. I'm like, sure. And they're like, oh yes, I can, or vice versa. I might think, not sure I can hear it, and they can. And at the end of the day, it's just going to show that cardiac auscultation is very subjective. But the funny thing about all of this is that I'm the one that does the cardiac ultrasound in the practice. So even though I might suffer a little bit for the auscultation, I'm usually the one doing the cardiac workup. And that's the perfect example of the strengths-based approach. It's about how the whole team comes together to complement one another.
Yes.
And I think that's something that some of the leadership manuals probably don't really tend to do. They have the concept of the omnicompetent vet that has to do everything. And we need to move away from that model and go, look, these are the people we have. These are the strengths that they have. Let's work out how we can utilize them.
Yeah, it's a team-based, right? It's a team-based approach rather than that top-down or this is just the way we've always done it. So I find in the same vein, I'm looking at a lot of the mental health and, advice that's being given out there. And I look at it very much the same way. It's like, wow, okay, it's great that yoga works for some people and taking a rest works for some people. But like that traditional advice, I don't see working for all of our brains either. Right?
Absolutely. I think, though, if we take a macro view of a lot of this, it's almost something I talk about a lot, which is the reflex to individualize our problems. So it almost reflects to go, the mental health problems we have in the profession are an individual problem, and they're not the problem of systems that are working. And so they then offer solutions that are individual. You have to do yoga, you have to do mindfulness, and so on. And I think we've tried the resilience narrative for 30, 40 years. It hasn't changed anything. And resilience needs to be a system, it needs to be community-based. I think that tendency to individualize is a big part of the problem. It's actually the deeper layer below resilience. We're individualizing. And if you think about it, our clinical training is quite reductionist. It tells us that an animal is not healthy, but the problem is the organ, it's its liver or its heart. So we are trying to individualize to an organ or a person, or taking a macro view. And I think the funny thing is, as a profession, we're very good at system thinking with One Health and ecosystems and those kind of things, but we do apply a very reductionist and individualized lens when we look at mental health in our profession.
Yeah, I love that. It's almost like visually in my head, I'm going, oh, what's the CBC chemistry for mental health, right? Rather than just go, here's burnout, and this is how you do burnout. It's like, well, what's the CBC chemistry or the minimum database that you need to figure out the person's, treatment plan?
Absolutely. And it's funny how, if you look at the mental health programs, a lot of them, don't really ask for data. We have very little data on mental health in the vet profession, and most of it is either around suicide. And a lot of it also doesn't even ask the right questions. So, for example, in Australia, the Australian Veterinary Association does a workforce survey every couple of years. And one of the things that we asked them to do was to include some new demographics for the first time. And one of those was disability, neurodivergent, chronic illness, and other groups as well. And what they found was that 38% of vets in Australia had chronic illness, neurodivergent, and disability. Now, that number is probably underrepresented, but regardless, it still shocked a lot of people as to the scale and the potential impacts of ableism. And when you combine that with another study in the UK, which shows that 1 in 4 vets and 1 in 4 vet nurses in the UK are planning to leave the profession within 5 years. 1 in 4 of those people planning to leave in 5 years are planning to leave because of lack of accommodation or adjustments due to mental health, disability, or disclosed neurodivergent. Disclosed neurodivergent, so that they know that they're neurodivergent. So when you combine those two data points, start to realise that there's a lot of things that they're not looking at. And the problem is that they've applied a lens as to how they look at burnout and mental health in the veterinary profession because they're not asking the right questions. You won't get the answer you're looking for. And this is why we haven't succeeded in changing things in 30 or 40 years. And I fundamentally believe that if they would do this, it would be one of the most transformative things for the veterinary profession in a generation.
Yeah, I just could imagine how that would translate to all other professions too, if we could just nail that down. Like I know with my coaching clients, like I get to authenticity is really the crux of what we work on. And I watch these veterinarians and these practice managers and technicians, and I'm working with like a human dentist and a human nurse. And I watch them go like, I'm burnt out. I want out of the medical field. And then we work together. We really get to the core needs of who they are as a person and what they could like empower them to ask for their needs when it is safe to do so. And they come alive. Like they're not burned out. It's like a different type of burnout. They're just burned out from not being accepted or being allowed to be who they are or even know who they are.
People who don't experience that, they don't see that as an issue because they have this bias of not having to experience it. It's a privilege that to them is invisible. And I think ultimately that's the challenge for us both and for other people who advocate in this space, who are trying to convince decision makers that this phenomenon is real.
Yeah, I'm so interested to read up more on that study. At 38% seems, it seems low to your point earlier, but also if we're saying the general population is 20% or 1 in 5 are neurodivergent, like that to me tells me there's already a higher incidence of neurodivergence within the veterinary field, which proves the point that at least I thought of for years now, going, there has to be a higher incidence. Like maybe it's confirmation bias, but I feel like everyone I talk to is like, oh, I've got this, I've got that. And maybe it's just the people I talk to, but I swear it feels like there is a lot more. But I'm glad there's a study that sort of proves me right.
That kind of makes sense because there's another study that looked at chronic illness, neurodivergent disability, specifically in the veterinary profession. And it's a great study. And it is jam-packed with insights. And I'm surprised that more people haven't picked up on it. But one of the takeaways that came out of it for me was that they looked at the time to disclosure for a number of different conditions, and that for males, it would be an average of 6 to 12 months from most conditions, physical, mental, and so on, and that for females, it would be twice as long. They didn't give the reason for why, but we can probably speculate that it has a lot to do with medical gaslighting. But what was really interesting was that for neurodivergent, 1/3 of vets who were neurodivergent took more than 11 years to get a diagnosis. And when you think about it, it actually makes sense because our profession is heavily feminized and the diagnostic criteria are skewed towards males. There are a lot of female vets who are neurodivergent and they believe that they have anxiety, depression, and they may develop issues like alcoholism or whatever. And that's simply a coping mechanism because of their cognitive load. And that's actually been the journey of a number of vets that I've spoken to. And people focus on the substance abuse side of it, but that's actually a much deeper issue that they were made to feel bad about. And when you understand the arc of that, it's actually quite tragic. But it's because our profession hasn't yet got the imagination or the mindset to grasp some of this. Which is really why I feel that we have to bring all these data points together and force the decision makers to do a lot more research in this space.
Yeah, I've got a friend of mine who does a lot of work in the substance use. And the funny thing is the ones that I know and are, in recovery and, lifelong journey of dealing with that is there are neurodivergent now that I think about it. Like they are like most of my friends who are that way are ADHD and have said it. And I think in the back of my head, I've always thought as substance use as a coping mechanism, but I've never really put it together as far as researched it and looked at it from that perspective. So thank you for that.
Well, I think that the problem with a lot of regulators will also tend to frame it as a moral problem, when a lot of the research would indicate that substance use is a medical issue. So a lot of it really means that the whole system needs an overhaul, that the whole ecosystem needs to be looked at.
I find it so interesting that at least in people medicine, right? Because this is all about people medicine in a lot of ways, is that it is very siloed out. Like you go to your gastroenterologist and they deal with that, and you go to another specialist and you go for that. But like very few people are looking at the entire system. Like I just think about my own medical issues, and I think about like I got all these diagnoses. I had IBS, I had whatever. And then looking back, it's like, oh, well, now we have neurodivergence on board. Like that's not IBS; those are abdominal migraines. And you look at it from the entire human, like just one body system of what's going on. Everything sort of made sense rather than treating everything in a silo and never understanding the entire whole person. I think that's the same thing about mental health, right? We're not looking at the entire person. Where to your point earlier is like, okay, you've got burnout. This is how you deal with it. This is the single solution or the three things you do for that, and band-aiding it. We could talk about this forever.
Well, I think that actually a need, otherwise than what Richard said, Ron, I think there's a need for people who can translate this. There's definitely a need and a role for that.
Yeah, there's somebody to look at the entire the entire medical chart rather than just yours here. It's like what sometimes we do in veterinary medicine. Oh, the patient's here for the ears, so I'm only going to look at the ears, right? Or the patient's here for that, and you get tunnel vision into what they're presenting for rather than looking at the whole pet sometimes.
But it is hard to do not to get tunnel vision sometimes, especially when you're time poor and resource poor. But I think anybody who does small animal medicine internists will kind of go, well, sometimes they have to take a step back and look at the macro view. And if you've got a GP vet that has been going, well, I've been trying to sort these dog problems for 2-3 years and I'm not getting on top of it, and I've tried all these different things. At some point they have to go, well, this isn't working anymore. I need to get a fresh pair of eyes, and maybe it has to be somebody who's looking at the big picture instead of the detail and getting right down the weeds. They need to get somebody to take a sky view, a skyline view of everything. And I think sometimes we get some very different insights that way. It's the surprising sort of connection that we can make when we do that.
What do you want veterinary leaders, veterinary practice owners, the corporations, like what do you want people to know about neurodivergence or equity and inclusion, all of the work that you do? Like what would you want them to know and learn today if they could?
We've been talking about hours. I think probably the most important thing that we can do is to develop the concept of unlearning. Unlearning for me is the most important skill set in learning. And we think that the goal is to learn everything there is to know in a chosen field or to at least keep up. But I actually would argue that one of the most important things is to unlearn what you know. And also probably to become aware of, keep an eye out for the hidden curriculum and how the hidden curriculum shows up in education, in your workplaces, and in your system. That's really, really important. I think the other thing is around curiosity as well. We talk about kindness, and kindness is part of the inclusion mindset, but kindness on its own will not solve the problem at all. We need to have curiosity. If I were to talk about curiosity, I would go a step further and talk about cultural humility. And we talk a lot about cultural competence as if we're supposed to master something. We're supposed to master everything there is to know about another culture. But in actual fact, we never can learn everything about another culture. We can't. And cultural competence and cultural humility were probably developed in terms of culture in the traditional sense or race. But we can apply cultural humility thinking to neurodivergence, to disability, to the queer community as well. They have their own different subsets of culture, their own way of thinking, their own way of viewing the world, and their own value systems. And to me, I think if we focus on those three things, unlearning, curiosity, and cultural humility, we'll probably go a long way toward developing the mindset to make inclusion stick and work.
I haven't talked about this much on the podcast here, but I am in the middle of publishing a book, and it's called Rewriting the Rules, because I love what you're saying is the unlearning part, because a lot of it is just breaking I call it the inherited systems. We've inherited these systems in our practices or in our workplaces of the times of factory workers or, times before that and times before that, where this is how things were. And, you had people tending to machines, and now we've got, we have people in the practice, right? No, like you don't have these giant machines and an assembly line in veterinary medicine. We've got people doing the work, but there's nobody tending to the people. And so really it's about breaking the inherited system, like asking the question, who gets praised and who gets left behind? Like who does the system work for and who does it not, and why? Right. And really like reflecting. So like that's step one is reflection, and then implementation, which I think you're going to go round and round and round on reflecting and implementing, and you're going to get it wrong and you're going to get it wrong. And until you get it, it's halfway right. And then creating sustainability is actually doing what you say you're going to do and creating sustainability, and then empowering the next generation to be curious as well, because the workplace should evolve with the people in it.
Absolutely. I think that we spoke earlier about leadership manuals. And I think one of the things that leadership manuals don't really talk about is the concept of repair, how to repair when you get things wrong. Okay to get things wrong. People are scared of inclusion because they're scared of offending people. Don't get of it. You will offend people. It will happen. It will happen. You don't have to be an asshole, but you will accidentally say something that will, put someone's nose out of joint. That's not the important part. The important part is learning how to repair and say, I got that wrong. How do I change that so I can get it right for next time? But that requires a very different way of thinking to how most leadership has been, which has been very hierarchical and it requires a vulnerability, but it's also a more evolved sort of leadership. It's also a trauma-informed form of leadership. And I think that is going to be the next big thing in veterinary medicine, or at least I hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I can't think of anyone who is not, anyone in a marginalized community that doesn't have some sort of form of trauma, right? It doesn't have to be complex, but you're going to step on someone's trigger at some point, right? It's just a matter of time. If you haven't done it already, which is crazy, then it's just a matter of time. And you're 100% right. Like needing to learn how to repair when you do step on someone's trigger or when you do get it wrong. And then actually listening, right? Like that's the big thing is the curiosity and the listening to when someone says, you stepped on my trigger, and understanding and not trying to impose that you're right just because what you said is right versus what what they're feeling.
Absolutely. I think that would be a huge change. While we're on that, I might go back to a point we made earlier about, you asked me about why I was interested in the neurodivergent community and the parallels. And one of those ones for me was recognizing that as a profoundly deaf person, I have a lot of things in common with the neurodivergent community. One of those for me was I realized that the double empathy problem applied to profoundly deaf people. It did the breakdown in communication. I'm the one that gets blamed. Same as neurodivergent people often are. And that goes back to a lot of the stuff that we're talking about, the hidden curriculum, the leadership styles and so on. There isn't a tendency to frame that you have two people there who both think differently, communicate differently. It's not about deficits, it's about strengths and so on, or even different ways of relating. The weird thing is I've actually put some of those things in writing. I'm still been blamed for the communication breakdown. I've done everything possibly right. I've written it down, still been blamed for it. But anyway, that still happens. And it's just weird that there tends to be this default to blaming certain groups for when things don't work. Yeah. And I think that's why I feel a lot of empathy with the neurodivergent community. And that probably would lead me to another point I want to make. The neurodivergent community in the veterinary space would do very well to make sure that they are also working with vets with disability and chronic illness, rather than acting separate to them, because all three groups are impacted by ableism. And all three groups will benefit from programs and solutions that combat that. As though we're more powerful together than we are separately. Yeah. And though probably a small reflection I would make is that I'm seeing a lot of neurodivergent focusing almost exclusively on neurodivergence. And I very consciously, quite early on, made a decision to not only speak about being a deaf vet. I wanted to speak about other forms of disability. I wanted to speak about neurodivergent and chronic illness, not for them, not on behalf of them, but to advocate for them and be allies for them. We do much, much better together.
No, I love that. I'm working with a few people right now, and we started in the neurodiversity space, right, and talking about advocacy, and it has certainly evolved into we need to be talking about disability in general, and that's just a piece of that pie, not the end. Like that's 100% is like we want to have the talk about the larger issue rather than just the micro issue within that pie.
It's interesting because sometimes when we even in our own communities, we sometimes listen to the language that is used, and we see some neurodivergent people say, "I'm not disabled, I don't have a disability," almost as if it's not a bad thing. But it's not. Disability is not a negative term. And I think that, to me, almost makes me think about internalized ableism. And then sometimes that comes out as lateral ableism. We tend to project our ableism onto other groups. So in the deaf space, for example, I don't sign. Then a lot of the older deaf will actually kind of look down on those who are part of the capital D deaf community and sign, because they have the whole culture around that. And they kind of look down at other, and it's ridiculous. It's absolutely ridiculous. And it's different ways of making sense of your disability, of living your life. And I actually get a little bit concerned when I see people say neurodivergent is not a disability. It can be. And why is that a problem? That if it is, it is a neutral term. There's nothing loaded or negative about the term, but I think we have to unpack lots of things. We don't do ourselves any favours when we try to separate ourselves out from others. For a long time, I used to not engage with the disability community because I had some internalized ableism, and I was trying to prove myself. And after a period of time, I realized that actually internalized ableism, and I've replaced that with disability pride. And part of that pride is saying, look, I'm part of where I'm not afraid to say I'm deaf, but I'm not afraid to talk about it in a very positive, open way. And part of that means that I'm going to share that with other people, that we can be positive about that. And that's all part of trying to change the narrative and reclaim the framing.
Yeah, I think that's really important. I know I definitely struggled with that very early on, claiming the identity and looking at like I don't feel disabled. Like I've been very successful in my career, but there's also been ways that I've quietly been disabled. And it's really like when you think about disability, it's the way society is constructed that creates disability, not the individual person is not disabled. It's disabling living in this society that is created around it.
So that's the social model of disability as opposed to the medical model. So the social model for people who are listening says that the barriers are created by society, not by the disability or the condition per se, whereas the medical model says that it's the individual condition that causes the problem.
Yeah.
Now, but the whole school of thought that the social model doesn't encapsulate everything that should, and it should go a lot further, like the human rights model and so on. That's not what we're here for.
Yeah.
But I guess it probably is still useful to talk about the medical versus social model because I regard that as an evolution of thinking. And I think it's interesting because we have medical training. We almost tend to default to the medical model, how we think about neurodivergence and disability. And that actually is part of the hidden curriculum that we have to interrogate.
That's so good, that hidden curriculum. I like that. I'm going to use that. I'm going to think about that now. That's the hidden curriculum. Now that I can see it and spot it. That's awesome. Well, it was such a pleasure to talk with you, and I appreciate it. Like I know it's probably early morning for you, and it's like evening for me. So there's a giant time difference and figuring out the schedule. So thanks for coming on today. Is there anything else you want the listeners to know before we head out?
No, I think I've really enjoyed having a chat with you, Ron. I think the thing that I want to finish off by saying, and also to say to the listeners, is I think the collaboration internationally is so important. We can't solve the problems in individual countries. We have to work together. We have to have the cross-pollination. We all have different approaches and different insights. And a lot of what I spoke about systems and learning from one another within the profession is also about international cross-pollination too, because different ways of looking at the same problem is how we're going to get the answers. That's probably what I would leave it on. And yeah, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Yeah. Oh, thank you again. I mean, we'll probably have you back because there's so much more I could talk about.
I could talk for hours.
Awesome.
I could talk for hours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to the episode of Left Unattended. A huge thank you to my guest, Dr. Alex Harrison. And of course, thank you, Dustin Bates, for editing and making sure this episode sounds as good as it feels. If today's conversation resonated with you, let's keep the conversation going. Join my newsletter for weekly updates on neuroinclusive leadership, www.syn-apt.me/newsletter. That's syn-app.me/newsletter. Learn more about coaching with me at coaching.syn-app.me. And finally, if you enjoyed this episode, please follow the podcast and leave a review. It helps more people find these conversations and reminds the world that belonging isn't a luxury. It's a leadership strategy. I'm your host, Ron Sosa, and this has been Left Unattended. Until next time.